Picture this: 1,000 tiny pinpricks of light dancing on the edge of a cracked window pane, each one a fleeting memory of a life I thought I knew. That's what I see every morning when I stand in my kitchen, coffee mug in hand, staring out at the world beyond my suburban cage. My name is Samantha, and I'm 43 years old, a number that feels more like a sentence than a milestone. I've been married to Daniel for 15 years, a man who once made my heart race with a single glance, but now barely looks up from his phone during dinner. We live in a quiet neighborhood in Ohio, where the houses all look the same, and the days blend into one long, monotonous blur. But beneath the surface of this ordinary life, there's a restlessness I can't shake, a whisper in the back of my mind that something is missing, something I can't quite name. I wasn't always like this, you know. There was a time when I dreamed of painting the world with bold strokes of color, when I'd spend hours sketching in notebooks, imagining a future as an artist. Daniel used to sit with me, watching in awe as my pencil brought imaginary landscapes to life. He'd tell me I could do anything, be anything. But somewhere along the way, those dreams got tucked into a drawer, replaced by bills and grocery lists, and the steady hum of routine. Now, I'm just Samantha, the woman who works part-time at the local library, who keeps the house tidy, who smiles politely at the neighbors, even when I feel like screaming. And Daniel? He's a financial advisor, always buried in spreadsheets, always chasing the next promotion, as if more money could fill the silence that's grown between us. Every morning I stand at that window, watching the early lights spill over the identical lawns, and I wonder how I got here. Was it one decision, one wrong turn, or a slow erosion of who I used to be? I see the other wives in the neighborhood, power walking with their yoga mats, chatting about book clubs and bake sales, and I feel like an imposter. They seem content, or at least they've mastered the art of pretending. Me? I'm unraveling, thread by thread, and I don't know how to stop it. There's a part of me that wants to grab Daniel by the shoulders, shake him until he sees me again, really sees me. But most days, I just sip my coffee and let the moment pass, because what's the alternative? Upending everything we've built for a feeling I can't even define. I remember the early days with Daniel, back when 15 years felt like a promise instead of a wait. We met at a friend's art gallery opening, two awkward souls bonding over a terrible abstract painting we both pretended to understand. He laughed at my sarcastic commentary, and I fell for the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. We were broke, living in a tiny apartment with mismatched furniture, but we were happy, or at least I thought we were. Those memories feel like they belong to someone else now, a version of me I can barely recognize. But this weekend, we're trying to reclaim a piece of that past, or maybe just escape the present for a while. Daniel suggested this cabin retreat up in the northern woods, a place he found online, tucked away from everything and everyone. I agreed, hoping the change of scenery might spark something between us, even if I'm not sure what. I woke up this morning to a warmth I hadn't felt in ages, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you believe, just for a second, that everything might be okay. Sunlight streamed through the towering pines outside, casting golden patterns across the rough-hewn walls of the cabin. It was like the forest itself was painting a masterpiece, and I was just lucky enough to witness it. I slipped out of bed, leaving Daniel still asleep, and padded barefoot to the tiny kitchen. The floorboards creaked under my weight, a sound that felt oddly comforting in this unfamiliar place. I set about making coffee, the old percolator gurgling to life as the rich, bitter aroma filled the air. I cracked open a window, and the scent of pine drifted in, mingling with the coffee in a way that made me pause and breathe deeper. For a moment, I felt like I could stay right there forever, suspended in that quiet, perfect stillness. But then I glanced outside and saw Daniel on the veranda. He was already up, sitting in one of the weathered Adirondack chairs with a book in his lap. He wasn't reading, though. His eyes were fixed on the lake beyond, a vast expanse of water that shimmered under the morning sun. His face was unreadable, distant, like he was looking at something I couldn't see. I called out to him softly, asking if he wanted a cup of coffee, but he just gave a small nod without turning his head. I brought it to him anyway, setting the mug on the armrest, and tried to strike up a conversation. Did he want to go for a walk along the shore? Maybe take a swim later if the water wasn't too cold. His answers were short, clipped, like he was only half listening. Maybe, he said. We'll see. I felt a pang of unease twist in my chest, a familiar ache I've learned to ignore over the years. He's probably just tired from the long drive up here, I told myself. We'd been on the road for hours yesterday, winding through endless back roads until we reached this hidden spot. I decided to give him space, hoping he'd come around. I poured myself a cup of tea instead of coffee, and wandered out to the terrace on the other side of the cabin. Settling into a wooden chair that looked like it had weathered 100 storms, I let my gaze drift to the lake. It was glassy, almost unnaturally still, reflecting the deep greens and blues of the surrounding woods, like a mirror to another world. I was just starting to lose myself in that reflection, the tea warming my hands, when I heard the crunch of gravel from the path leading up to the cabin. My first thought was that it must be a delivery, or maybe a neighbour from another property nearby, though I hadn't seen any other cabins for miles on our drive-in. I set my mug down on the small table beside me and stood, peering around the corner of the terrace toward the sound. 2 men were approaching, both tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in flannel and jeans like they belonged in these woods more than I ever could. One of them, the taller of the 2, raised a hand in a casual wave as they got closer. I hesitated, a flicker of unease stirring in my gut, but I waved back, figuring they must be here for a reason. I called out to Daniel, letting him know we had company, and he finally looked up from the lake, his expression shifting to something I couldn't quite place, almost like he'd been expecting this. He stood and walked over to join me as the men reached the edge of the terrace. The taller one introduced himself as Mark, his voice deep and steady, while the other, a bit shorter with a scruffy beard, said his name was Ethan. They mentioned something about checking on the property, a routine inspection or maintenance thing, but their words felt rehearsed, like they were reading from a script. I glanced at Daniel, waiting for him to confirm or explain, but he just nodded, his face still unreadable, and invited them to sit for a minute. I forced a polite smile, though something about the situation felt off, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. As we all settled around the small table, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. Mark and Ethan made small talk about the weather and the lake, but their eyes kept darting to Daniel, as if waiting for a signal. My tea was growing cold in my hands, but I barely noticed, my mind spinning with questions. Why hadn't Daniel mentioned this visit before? Why did he seem so calm, so unsurprised by their arrival? I tried to catch his eye, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but he avoided my gaze, focusing instead on the men, as if I wasn't even there. The air felt heavier now, the stillness of the morning replaced by a tension I couldn't name. Then Mark stood, his chair scraping against the wooden deck, and stepped closer to me. My breath caught as his hand landed on my shoulder, the weight of it too heavy, too familiar for someone I'd just met. I froze, the mug still clutched in my hands, as he leaned in, his face so close I could feel the warmth of his breath against my ear. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but the words hit me like a thunderclap. He wants to watch. We'll just do as he wishes. My heart stopped, a cold dread pooling in my chest. I pulled back, my eyes snapping to Mark's face, searching for any hint that this was some kind of sick joke, but his expression was serious, almost pitying, like he felt sorry for me. My gaze darted to Daniel, standing a few feet away near the railing, his face still calm, still unreadable. What was this? Watch what? My mind raced, 1,000 possibilities colliding, each one more unthinkable than the last. I turned back to Mark, my voice trembling as I stammered out, "What are you talking about? What does that mean?" But before he could answer, Ethan stepped forward, lingering near Daniel, his own voice low and measured as he spoke. "We've done this before, Samantha. Daniel reached out to us ahead of time. Everything's been arranged." The words landed like a punch to the gut, knocking the air out of me. Arranged. My husband, the man I'd shared a life with for 15 years, had planned this, whatever this was, with these strangers. My eyes shot back to Daniel, pleading for him to say something, to deny it, to tell me this was all a misunderstanding. But he just gave a slight nod, as if confirming every word they'd said. My stomach churned, a mix of betrayal and confusion swirling inside me as I stumbled back from the table, the mug slipping from my hands and shattering on the wooden deck. The sound echoed in the still morning air, sharp and jarring, but no one flinched. Not Mark, not Ethan, not even Daniel. They just watched me, waiting, as if I were the one who needed to catch up to a script they'd all memorized long ago. I couldn't stay out there on the terrace, under the weight of their stares and the suffocating tension. I muttered something incoherent, an excuse about needing a moment, and turned toward the cabin door, my legs shaky as I crossed the threshold into the dim interior. Inside, the light was muted, filtering through the thin curtains in pale, ghostly streaks that barely reached the corners of the room. The wooden floor creaked under my weight with every step, each sound amplified in the heavy silence that seemed to press against my skin like a physical force. I could feel Mark and Ethan behind me, their presence looming, even though I didn't turn to look. It was intimidating, the way they carried themselves with such quiet confidence, as if they'd walked this path 100 times before. Yet, there was something strangely reassuring about it too, a sense of inevitability, like they knew exactly how this would play out, and I was just along for the ride. My chest tightened at the thought, my breath coming in shallow bursts as I stopped in the middle of the small living area, my hands trembling at my sides. I forced myself to turn and face them, the dim light casting shadows across their faces, making it hard to read their expressions. My voice came out shaky, barely above a whisper, as I asked the question that had been clawing at me since Mark's chilling words on the terrace. Is this really what Daniel wants? Are you sure? I needed to hear it again, needed some kind of confirmation that this wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from. Mark stepped forward, his eyes softening just a fraction, and nodded. His tone was gentle but firm, leaving no room for doubt. He's clear about it, Samantha. He needs this. The words landed like stones in my gut, heavy and unyielding, and I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, a flush of anger and shame I couldn't control. I glanced past them, through the half-open door to the veranda where Daniel still sat, his back to us. Even from here I could see the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he held himself so still, like he was listening, waiting. My mind was a storm, thoughts crashing into each other with no clear direction. Anger burned hot at the forefront. How could Daniel put me in this position? How could he orchestrate something so unthinkable without even talking to me? Fear followed close behind, a cold dread about what this meant for us, for the fragile threads still holding our marriage together. And then, buried beneath it all, there was something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge. A growing, shameful curiosity. What would it feel like to let go, to step into this unknown and be seen in a way I hadn't been in years, maybe ever? The thought made my pulse race even faster, a frantic rhythm I could feel in my throat, my wrists, everywhere. My hands fidgeted with the hem of my shirt, twisting the fabric between my fingers as if it could anchor me to some kind of reality. The heat in my cheeks spread, a prickling warmth that made me hyper-aware of every sensation. The rough texture of the cotton against my skin, the slight dampness of sweat on my palms, the way my breath hitched every few seconds. Ethan moved closer then, his steps slow and deliberate, and I froze as his hand brushed lightly against my arm. His touch was gentle, almost hesitant, a stark contrast to the intensity of the moment. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low, searching. I didn't answer, couldn't find the words to form a response. But I didn't pull away either, and that silence felt like an answer in itself. The air in the cabin was thick, carrying the sharp scent of pine that seeped through the half-open door, wrapping around us like a heavy cloak. I stood there, rooted to the spot in the dim light of the cabin, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. The wooden floor beneath me felt uneven, its rough texture pressing into the soles of my bare feet, grounding me even as my mind spun out of control. I could still feel the ghost of Ethan's touch on my arm, warm and unfamiliar, a stark contrast to the cold dread pooling in my stomach. Mark stood a few steps away, his presence a quiet force, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. And beyond them, through that sliver of open door, Daniel's silhouette loomed on the veranda, a silent sentinel in the morning light. I don't know how it happened, how I let myself cross that invisible line. Maybe it was the weight of years of feeling invisible, of craving something, anything, to break through the numbness that had settled over my life. Or maybe it was the way the air seemed to hum with a strange electric charge, pulling me toward a moment I couldn't resist. My breath came in ragged bursts, each inhale sharp with the earthy tang of the forest outside, each exhale a shaky release of the tension I'd been holding for far too long. I took a step back, my legs trembling, until I felt the edge of a small rug underfoot, its frayed threads catching against my skin. Mark and Ethan moved with me, their movements slow, almost reverent, as if they understood the gravity of what was unfolding. The floorboards groaned softly as we shifted, the sound mingling with the distant trill of birds beyond the cabin walls. I lowered myself to the ground, the wood cool and unyielding against my knees, its grainy surface scraping lightly as I settled. The scent of pine grew stronger, mixing with the faint musk of old wood and something warmer, more human, as Mark and Ethan knelt beside me. I couldn't look at them directly, my eyes darting instead to the slivers of light sneaking through the curtains, painting jagged lines across the floor. But I felt their presence, the heat radiating from their bodies, the subtle brush of fabric as they adjusted their positions. My hands pressed flat against the floor, fingers splaying wide, as if I could anchor myself to this moment, to this reality, no matter how surreal it felt. My breath hitched louder now, a staccato rhythm that echoed in the small space, blending with the softer, steadier sounds of their breathing. The warmth of unfamiliar hands found me, tentative at first, then more assured, their touch igniting a fire under my skin that I hadn't felt in years. It was overwhelming, a rush of sensation that drowned out the chaos in my mind. The rough texture of the floor bit into my skin as I shifted, a sharp reminder of where I was, of what I was doing. Outside, the birds continued their song, oblivious to the storm unfolding within these walls, their calls a haunting counterpoint to the raw, unfiltered sounds escaping my lips. Every nerve in my body felt alight, hyper-aware of every brush, every whisper of movement, every fleeting second that stretched into eternity. Through the half-open door, I could still see Daniel's silhouette, unmoving on the veranda. The morning sun framed him in a halo of pale gold, but there was nothing angelic about the way he held himself. His posture was rigid, shoulders squared, head tilted just enough that I knew he was watching, observing with that eerie stillness that sent a shiver down my spine. There was no anger in the lines of his body, no hint of jealousy or outrage, just a quiet, almost clinical detachment, as if he were studying a painting or solving a puzzle. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him, even as my body surrendered to the moment, caught in a tug-of-war between the heat of now and the cold weight of his gaze. What did he see when he looked at me like this? Was it the woman he married? The one he'd once promised the world to? Or something else entirely? Something broken? Something new? Inside me, emotions clashed like thunderheads, a chaotic storm of turmoil and revelation that I couldn't begin to untangle. But as the intensity of the moment began to ebb, a heavy stillness settled over the cabin, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves outside. I stayed there on the floor for what felt like an eternity, my chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, my mind a tangled mess of what had just happened. Mark and Ethan eventually stood, their movements quiet as they stepped back, giving me space to gather myself. I couldn't look at them, couldn't face the reality of their presence just yet. Instead, I stared at the worn wooden floor, tracing the scratches and knots with my eyes, as if they held answers I desperately needed. I heard the creak of the veranda chair outside, a slow, deliberate sound that cut through the silence like a blade. My gaze snapped up to the doorway, and there was Daniel, rising from his seat with a measured slowness that made my stomach twist. His silhouette filled the frame for a moment, backlit by the late morning sun, before he stepped inside. The light streamed in behind him, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor that stretched toward me like accusing fingers. I was still sitting there, my clothes rumpled and askew, my hair a wild mess around my face. Shame burned hot in my chest, mingling with a stubborn streak of defiance I couldn't suppress. What right did I have to feel ashamed when he had orchestrated this? Yet the weight of his gaze made me feel exposed in a way I hadn't anticipated. He approached me with steady steps, the floorboards groaning softly under his weight, each sound amplifying the tension that hung between us. I braced myself, expecting harsh words or a cold stare, but instead, he lowered himself to one knee beside me. His presence was overwhelming up close, the familiar scent of his cologne mixing with the lingering pine in the air. I flinched when his hand reached out, his fingers brushing against my hair with a gentleness that caught me off guard. His touch was firm, though, grounding, as if he were trying to anchor me in this moment. I dared to meet his eyes, searching for anger, disgust, anything I could understand. But what I saw was something else entirely, an intensity that burned through me, a depth I hadn't seen in years, maybe ever. "Now I've seen the real you," he whispered, his voice low and steady, almost reverent. The words sent a shiver racing down my spine, cold and electric all at once. I didn't know what to make of them, didn't know how to process the way they seemed to strip me bare. I scanned his face, desperate for a hint of judgment or pain, something to tell me how he truly felt about what he'd just witnessed. But there was none of that. Instead, there was a strange satisfaction etched into the lines of his expression, as if he'd finally uncovered a truth he'd been searching for, a piece of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for far too long. My throat tightened, words piling up behind my lips but refusing to come out. What could I even say? How could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? In that moment, sitting there under the weight of his gaze, I forced myself to confront the raw truth of what had just happened. I waited for regret to crash over me like a wave, for the guilt to drown me in its undertow. But it didn't come. Instead, there was a quiet admission, a whisper in the back of my mind that I couldn't ignore. I didn't regret it. Not really. There was a part of me, a part I'd buried under years of routine and expectation, that had needed this, needed to shatter the mold of who I thought I was supposed to be. I'd spent so long feeling invisible, fading into the background of my own life, that this moment, as twisted and unthinkable as it was, felt like a release. It was as if I'd finally stepped out of a shadow I hadn't even realized I was living in. Daniel stood then, extending a hand to help me up. His grip was warm, steady, and I let him pull me to my feet, my legs still shaky beneath me. We didn't speak, but the silence between us was filled with an understanding that words could never capture. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment if you enjoyed this story. This will help us create more engaging stories for you.